Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the Connecticut Freedom Trail was established by law by the General Assembly to tell the stories of the Black narratives of the struggle for freedom and dignity within the Black and African American communities. It started in August of 1995, officially opened September 1996 in 60 towns with 30 sites. And today we are upwards of 170 plus in 70 towns with the initial goal to get one in all 169 municipalities. Today we are going to be talking with a filmmaker and a genealogist. But before we get to our guest today, please let me do a little housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments, put them into the sections on whatever social media platform you're watching us from. And also take our survey. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know if there's anything you would like for us to cover. Today, we are joined today by New Jersey native Dolly Marshall. She's an award-winning historian, preservationist, activist, and educator at Mount Peace Cemetery in Lawnside, New Jersey. She is now serving as a trustee for the Mount Peace Association and volunteers as a docent at the New Jersey State House. She's also a member of the Association of Black Women Historians, the National Council of Negro Women, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Ms. Marshall is also the creator of the documentary Champion for Freedom, the Reverend Alexander Heritage Newton's Story. And joined with her today will be John Mills. John is originally from San Diego, California, but now lives here in Connecticut. He is a genealogist, independent scholar, and founder of the Connecticut-based Alex Breon Corporation. John is a descendant of the enslaved as well as a descendant of enslavers. John focuses on unearthing little-known people and stories of this country's history in slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. John's goal is to honor the forgotten as well as to apply critical thinking to our history as a means to find solutions to the many ripple effects today. So we're going to start with Dolly, then we'll go to John, and then as usual, we will have Q&A at the end of the presentation. So Dolly, welcome to Connecticut Freedom Trail.
Thank you. It's nice to be back in Connecticut, sort of. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Tammy. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on your program today. It's such a pleasure. Good afternoon to everyone that's listening and streaming in live with us. To all the viewers, it's such an honor to be on the panel, and again with John Mills and Mariana from Connecticut's CTOldStateHouse. This is going to be really informative, engaging, and I hope you will come away with learning some new history in regards to the great state of Connecticut. But thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'll start with what it is that I do. I am a historian and a preservationist. I am based in New Jersey, so not too far from the great state of Connecticut. And I specialize in rediscovering and interpreting untold African American and African diaspora stories and narratives. So with my work based in cemetery preservation, I come across through research and through just general reading and observing stories of forgotten individuals, in particular in the African American community. So I'm from New Jersey, born and raised. I've always had an affinity for people, and I've always loved to hear oral history in particular. So I grew up with my mom and dad sharing about our family history. I come from a long line of African Americans, free and enslaved, and just learning through doing my own family's genealogy, the depth and breadth of history really keeps me motivated. So I'll start. I am a trustee of Mount Peace Cemetery, one of the trustees, as Tammy mentioned in the intro. Mount Peace Cemetery is an African-American cemetery founded in 1900 in Lawnside, New Jersey. Mount Peace was founded by African-Americans for African-Americans because during this time in the 20th century, early 20th century, Blacks could not be buried in the same burial grounds as whites. So the county, Camden County, where Mount Peace is located, only had a few African-American cemeteries. So by the late 1800s, those cemeteries were becoming filled to capacity. So by the turn of the 20th century, 1900, there was a need to create a new cemetery, and that's how Mount Peace came to be. So I always knew about Mount Peace Cemetery because, like I said, through my parents and grandparents, I knew that it was an African-American cemetery locally. However, I didn't know the depths of the connection or connections that I had to the cemetery until a much later period. So we'll fast forward to 2018 is when I was doing a particular deep dive on my great-great-grandfather, a Civil War veteran, a Navy veteran, a man by the name of William Hegeman, and it led me to Mount Peace. And Mount Peace, in proximity to where I live, is about a 5-minute, less than a 5-minute drive from my home. So it got me to wanting to investigate further to see if I could find his resting place. So fortunately, combing through the records in our local historical society, I was able to come across his grave card, and his grave card actually gave a section and a grave number to where he was buried. So it wasn't relatively difficult, although it can be difficult locating burials and graves, in particular in African-American cemeteries. So when I came across that information, I was excited. Now, mind you, by 2018, Mount Peace Cemetery is not an active cemetery. It's a historic site, and it's strictly does not take in new burials. So it's being maintained as a historic site and preserved in that capacity. So I got on the computer and I Googled to try to find information. Now, at that time, there was no website or any type of social platforms for me to connect with. So I just did cold calls and looked in newspapers and came across an article from the previous year of one of the other trustees, who happens to be secretary of the cemetery, reached out to her after I located her telephone number, called and introduced myself and said I was looking for my great-great-grandfather. And she informed me that he, if he was a Civil War veteran, that he was most likely buried in a section in Mount Peace called Soldiers Row, and that years before, her father, who was one of the trustees before her, compiled with another gentleman an index of all the Civil War soldiers that are buried in Mount Peace. Now, Mount Peace has a large number of veterans of all wars, but in particular, we have many Civil War veterans, especially United States colored troops. And my great-great-grandfather was buried in that section. So naturally, I couldn't wait to go to the cemetery. I went, was able to find his grave, in particular because the grave card had listed, indicated whether he had a headstone or not. And it said, yes, he did. And it was a beautiful sight, to say the least, when I first entered the cemetery and was able to locate him. He's buried in a row with other Civil War veterans, including John Henry Lawson, who is a National Medal of Honor winner for the Navy during the Civil War, who's also buried in our cemetery. So that initial experience got me to thinking more broadly, not just about my own family's genealogy and history, but other people, because people were interested when I would share, about my rediscovery and finding not too long after my great-great-grandfather, but other family members. As it stands right now, I have about 15 ancestors buried in Mount Peace on my maternal side. So other people were interested, but other people didn't know how to go about finding their ancestors. So not too long after that, really immediately after my first visit, I was asked to join the board of Mount Peace, and I became a trustee subsequently after that. And from that period, from 2018, I was just kind of up and running with trying to create innovative ways, not only to educate the public, but to engage not only the local community, but the broader community, other states and nationally. And, I've been pretty successful in doing that. And I'm always reading and researching. And not too long after that, I came across Alexander Heritage Newton. Now, that name probably sounds familiar to all of you viewers in Connecticut. I first read Alice de Breyer's probably in late 2018, early 2019. And I was just so fascinated by all of the people that are buried in Mount Peace, everyday people, but all of the people that made so many important contributions and sacrifices that have since gone either untold or unknown and erased to history. So in particular, Alexander Heritage Newton, I read his biography that was written in 1910 in Camden, New Jersey, which is the city where I grew up and the city where Reverend Newton later spent his later years after first migrating from the South up to then to New Haven, and then subsequently going across the country in his ministerial work. But I read that and got really interested in Alexander Newton as a person, and just his description of his experiences during the Civil War, experiences with fighting for basic human equality and citizenship, really aligned with my passion, really aligned with my mission in to make sure people were aware that those such as Alexander Newton, what they had to deal with and what they encountered. So with that, his connections to the Underground Railroad, I felt, were really not recognized as they should be. And I was very interested in making sure that they would be recognized not only on the local level, but on a national level, a national level. And so I was researching his early life in New Bern, North Carolina, where he was born in 1837, researching about his mother, Mary Newton, a free woman of color, his father, Thaddeus Newton, born enslaved, and just the dichotomy that Alexander, along with his other siblings, had to live on a day-to-day basis, experiencing the lines between oppression and freedom. So with that, I'm presented my research to the National Park Service. The National Park Service has a wonderful program called Network to Freedom, which denotes sites, programs, and facilities that have made a huge impact on the Underground Railroad. So Alexander Newton, of course, along with his mother and father, have a direct connection to the Underground Railroad, not only for their own personal familial experiences, but also for helping other freedom seekers. And Alexander Newton highlights that in his 1910 book, Out of the Briars, the instance about dressing his foreman in women's clothes in the attempts to secure this man's freedom from North Carolina to the North. And stories such as those were just so fascinating to me. And then even more so, the connections that I have with Reverend Newton, I started realizing in his later years the huge impact that he made as a minister. So after his distinguished service in the Civil War, he devoted his life to ministerial work within the AME Church, which stands for the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And for more than 50 years, Reverend Newton made huge impacts all across the country, building churches, growing congregations, encountering racism, and encountering other stories of inequality. He was sent by the AME Church to Pulaski, Arkansas. And Pulaski, if you're not aware, is the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. So Reverend Newton was placed in these hot spots at a pivotal time in our nation's history. And he personally encountered racism and discrimination, and as well as was a conduit and a mediator and a faith-based leader to helping other individuals all across the country, also in Louisiana, and of course in New Jersey. Now, mind you, a lot of people think northern states don't experience or have as much racism as southern states, but they do. And Newton detailed this in his book, Out of the Briars. So when he came to New Jersey, he pastored in two churches, primarily in the city of Camden. However, he also pastored churches in New Brunswick. He pastored churches in Morris County, in Princeton, in Cape May. So he was all across the state, but he ended up settling in Camden. And in his later years was highly active in not only the church, but in the community at large. He was a Mason, a Freemason, and he held every high position within the Masonic fraternal organization that you can imagine. He was a chaplain. He led the prayer for a week in 1887 for the New Jersey State Legislature. So this goes to show you how influential a person he was. So with all that, I wanted to, working on a book, but books take time, and you're always researching and revising things. But I wanted to find a way to really engage with the public and get some information out about Reverend Newton in the interim. So I was inspired to create a short film, and I created a short film, and it's called Champion for Freedom, the Reverend Alexander Heritage Newton story. And it premiered on June 15th at Connecticut's CTOldStateHouse. And it was a labor of love because in a minimal amount of time, I was able to shed light on Reverend Newton's impact and his contributions, not only as a a Civil War veteran, but as a minister and as a Mason. And the film will eventually be available through our website. I'll share the information before I leave the program. But in the meantime, I am taking this film on the road and sharing it with the public. I was so happy that it was well received. And I was so proud to be able to premiere this film in the state of Connecticut because of Reverend Newton's connections to Connecticut. So with that, I'm going to show you a couple of slides because I really want you all to see Reverend Newton, how our history is not just New Jersey history or Connecticut history, how it's all American history. So next slide, please. So I want to start out probably with some history that you all might be familiar of, especially with the Connecticut Freedom Trail and with my film being premiered in the Old State House, the case of the Amistad and the captive Africans in 1839, the famous trial that was held at the Old State House. I pulled a newspaper article from the Philadelphia Inquirer the day after Christmas in 1889. And just to give you a quick summary, this newspaper article was an interview by a gentleman named Robert Purvis, who was also a very well-known abolitionist. And Robert Purvis actually was the person that commissioned this famous portrait that hangs in the New Haven Museum of Cinque. Underneath the portrait is the artist Nathaniel Jocelyn. So Purvis commissioned that portrait. That portrait hung for many years in the Purvis home in Philadelphia. And I just think the connections to Philadelphia, Robert Purvis, who is another very well-known abolitionist, to Connecticut is an amazing thing. Next slide. Again, here is the portrait of Cinque and Robert Purvis on the right. Now, I also have a personal connection to Robert Purvis because I am a descendant of another abolitionist named James Forten. And Robert Purvis married into my Forten family when he married Harriet Forten, who is the daughter of James Forten. Again, another amazing connection. Next slide. And this is a photograph taken last year at the Museum of the American Revolution when they put on an amazing year-long exhibit called Black Founders. And that's me in the center with the stars, no stripes, but stars on my jacket with several Purvis descendants. And that's a picture on the right of Robert Purvis in his later years. Next slide. And this is a photograph that you're probably all familiar with, but this is a photograph of a young Alexander Heritage Newton during his Civil War tenure. And I'm just so fascinated about his firsthand experiences. In particular, Alexander Newton was present during the 1863 New York Draft Massacre, where Black people were being attacked in the streets of New York due to the Conscription Act. The draft was enlisting men who didn't want to be enlisted or didn't want to be drafted. And in the melee, Black businesses were getting burned, Black people were getting stoned and lynched. And in this melee, there was a colored orphanage with over 300 children that was being burned as well. The children were gotten out safe. However, Reverend Newton, or Alexander Newton, was present during this time, running through the streets for his life in New York City. Next slide. That's a photograph of the orphanage, originally located on Fifth Avenue between 42nd and 43rd Streets. And there's fire and flames all around. Next slide. This is another connection to Connecticut during the Civil War with the 54th Massachusetts colored troop. So the New York Draft Massacre, 2 days after the massacre subsided, this gentleman was considered at the time the oldest member of the regiment at 46. Can you believe it? 46 years old. This is Peter Vogelzang Jr., who, like I said, was in the 54th Massachusetts, who also has a connection to Alexander Newton's brother, Stephen Newton, who also was a member of the 54th Massachusetts regiment. And unfortunately, Stephen was killed at the second attack on Fort Wagner. Again, many connections and parallels. Next slide. And that's a photograph illustration of the second attack on Fort Wagner. Next slide. And Pete Vogelzang has another direct connection to the city of New Haven and the state of Connecticut because he was one of the founding members of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. It is the third oldest Black Episcopal church in the United States. He was one of the founding members, along with Alexander Du Bois, who is the great-grandfather of W.E.B. Du Bois. Next slide. And this is Charlotte Fortin Grimke, an abolitionist, educator, and poet, and well known for her diaries that she kept as a teacher in Beaufort during her time in Beaufort, South Carolina during the Civil War. She was one of the first teachers from the North to come to the South to teach newly freed, enslaved people at the schools there. And she came in direct contact as well with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and many connections there you can read about in her diaries that have been published many, many times. Next slide. Oh, I think that was the last slide. I ended on that slide because Charlotte also is my ancestor, and it just gives me such pride to be able to make all these connections and really showcase that these are real people. They're not just people in history books, but they were real people with real lives, and their impact is still being made today. That's why I feel it's so important that we be diligent in preserving cemeteries and making sure we have interpretation, and that we share this knowledge by coming together like John and I did at the Connecticut StateHouse, and like we're doing today, because with that, that's the only way how we're going to make sure that these great individuals get their stories heard and that they're appreciated and that we could still learn from. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to coming up to Connecticut again and sharing some more great history. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks a lot for that, Dolly. Mariana, I'll speak for a second, and then Mariana, if you can bring up my slides. I'm John Mills. I'm the president and founder of the Alex Brand Corporation. We're a Connecticut-based nonprofit, and what we do is we do research into the formerly enslaved, and generally we're looking at people that weren't considered to be the exceptionalists. They didn't conquer any land. They are the everyday enslaved person that, in my mind, were the heroes. They're the million in that 1 in a million equation. And I exist because they endured and they persevered. And so we research those people. And then once we get a good swath of information about them, we try to find their current day descendants to give them that information. But we also try to inject them into the communities where they lived, worked, and died. So that's the type of stuff that we do. Mariana, if you can bring up my slides, that would be great. and I'll start walking through them. And so I was researched when I'll tell you kind of the story of how I came across Dolly Marshall. I was researching a completely different gentleman who was imprisoned in Wethersfield, Connecticut. His name was Prince Mortimer. And he was said to have been buried at the cemetery next to that prison. And I was talking to a historian in Wethersfield, and he told me about another gentleman supposedly buried there, and his name was Nicholas Monroe. I'd later learn that it appears that his body may have been actually sent to Yale for dissection. I would later learn that, but I was researching Nicholas Monroe, and I learned that he had been in the Connecticut 30th Colored Regiment during the Civil War, and I didn't know anything about the 30th Regiment. I didn't know much about Connecticut's role within the Civil War, which took me down this path to start researching the colored regiments of Connecticut in the Civil War, and like who these men were, what did they do? Like, I wanted to have, understand what type of reverence I should have for these people. And so that got me into actually researching the Civil War in Connecticut. And I learned about how the Militia Act of 1862 allowed state militias to enlist Black men, and states started in creating these colored regiments, Connecticut not being one of them until late in 1863, when Connecticut was under fire from Lincoln, from the federal government, because they hadn't met their quota of 7,700 men established in March of 1863. And so that number, they were 5,400 men short. That number was going to be doubled. Lincoln was threatening the state if they didn't get these men by January 5th of 1864. And so that's when Connecticut starts down this path of creating a colored regiment. And the state, there were people here that, Connecticut was under fire, but it wasn't as if, it was something that the state necessarily wanted to do, right? Like, they just had to do it. This is a gentleman by the name of William Eaton. He was the chief judge in Hartford at the time. He would eventually become a U.S. senator from Connecticut after the war. And he makes these statements that you see in the papers of the time where, he says, I would rather let loose the wild Comanche than the ferocious Negro. They're going to invade the homes of their former masters with lust, raping, and murder. He was like, give Black people guns. That's like the craziest thing he had ever heard, right? But again, Connecticut was under fire. They kind of had to raise a colored regiment. So I'm learning, these challenges that these Black men that were going to join this regiment were going to have to face, because there was racism and bias. Even though slavery had ended in Connecticut, racism and bias, a distinct thing that all still existed. And I started reading these books, by these men that had actually been in Connecticut's 29th Colored Regiment. Alexander Newton being one of those men, Isaac J. Hill being another one of them. And so reading what their experiences were like, right? I read in Isaac J. Hill's book, and he talked about how he arrived in New Haven, they're being mustered in, and the men weren't giving their bounty. These Black men weren't given the bounty, the bonus for enlisting that was promised, right? And so because of them not receiving this bonus, they made no mention to the flag, a scenario that I've only ever heard in the past with regard to like the 68 Olympics and the Black men on the podium with the Black fist, or like Colin Kaepernick. I learned that there were these Black men in this colored regiment in Connecticut that did this back in 1864. I also learned about these men facing racism while they're out and about. I learned about them going to Annapolis initially, and in Annapolis, there's these enslavers and these enslaved people, Maryland being a border state, and them facing racism there. Also, I heard about while they were in battle during the Richmond-Petersburg campaign, Isaac J. Hill talks about finding a man who had been shot in the head, and he props him up against a tree, and he goes back to his station, and he comes back hours later, and he hadn't been treated while other men had been. And he mentions about the complexion and rank of a man had a great bearing. There was a great distinction made amongst the wounded. Basically, he's saying if you were of higher rank or if you were white, you may be treated when wounded in the field more quickly than if you were Black. So, all of these things that they had to endure while trying to fight for this country. Also, on arriving back to Connecticut, war is over. They're arriving back, and Isaac, in the papers of the time, you can see that there was a concern by some in the state that white Americans wouldn't show up to celebrate their return. So I see articles in the paper pleading with the public. These men, fought for white men who were allowed to stay home, white men who likely abused them. You should show up and celebrate them, which kind of told me a context as well about who these people were and how they were treated while actually trying to serve this country. Also, I learned about in October or in November of 1865, how it was put up for vote in the state of Connecticut whether or not they wanted to remove the requirement of being white from the state constitution as a requirement to vote. And the state of Connecticut voted that down. So as they were arriving back to Connecticut after serving in the war, they're also learning that in Connecticut, the state has just voted down their right to vote. So they endured, right? Like they showed up when the state needed men to serve, and in doing so, they faced racism initially when getting there with regards to their pay. They faced racism while they were out and about in the field, and even when they're coming back to Connecticut after it's over, they're hearing about racism relative to their ability and their rights to vote. While they're here, they're standing at the Connecticut CTOldStateHouse, and the Governor Buckingham is talking to them. And in his speech, which is all documented in the papers of the time, he is even essentially apologizing to them with regards to the state disallowing them the right to vote after they've put forth such an effort in supporting this country, representing this state. So in learning all these things, I also learned about the monument at Crisqualo Park, which is where they were mustered in New Haven. At the time, it was called Grapevine Point. I went down there to check out that monument there, and I learned when I arrived there that there were 1,001 names on that monument. But I had also done other research prior to looking at that monument and had discovered that there were actually some 1,248 men in the 29th. So if we just consider the 29th, there's some 247 names missing off that monument, right? But there were also another 470 men who were overflow from the 29th that made up the 30th Connecticut Colored Regiment. So if you include them, there's some 700 plus men that are not on that monument. As well as I noticed that the monument also replicates the names of the white officers for every time that they promote. So there's a lot missing from that. All of this kind of aligns really well to the type of work I do, which is find these areas within our communities where there are these people that endured, survived, these African Americans, and yet they're not presented or positioned in those communities as ever having had that influence, right? And I think, from a community perspective, and then from an African American perspective, I think I think it's a slap in the face when we don't represent these people the way they should be represented. I chased down Isaac J. Hill to see what happened to him after the war. It turns out he went back to New Jersey, where he had lived prior to the war, and was buried at Renbank Colored Cemetery in Woodbury, New Jersey. Turns out that cemetery had been paved over to make a parking lot sometime in 1962. And so he was, even though he had this contribution, even in his hometown, he wasn't presented as I believed he should be. Same thing with Alexander Newton. While he went back to New Jersey, and as Dolly mentioned, he's buried at Mount Peace and has an amazing a stone there representing him. His mother and father, Mary and Thaddeus, who, again, as Dolly said, were from New Bern, North Carolina, and fled New Bern to come to New York. Mary did, his mother, to find ways to free her husband, and then eventually the family in totality moved to New Haven. And we know the story about Alexander, and him joining the Connecticut 29th. He brought along his younger brother, William, who was 15, and he was in the 29th as well as a servant, and his brother, Stephen, who went to the 54th and eventually died at the assault on Fort Wagner, as Dolly mentioned, in chasing down their parents, the enslaved man Thaddeus and his mother Mary, who freed him. I discovered that, they were buried at Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, and years, a century ago, their headstone had fallen over, cracked in half, and over the decades was just seeping further and further into the ground. I wanted to do something about that. All of this stuff were things that I could actually relate to. I could relate to them because back in 2003, on the 4th of July, 2003, I had walked through the woods behind a whites-only cemetery looking for my second great grandfather, Ned Mills, who was enslaved in Texas. And I had to walk past this whites-only cemetery to get into those woods looking for these stones. And I found some stones in my family, and some of them were buried, and some of them were broken. But to get to those woods, I'm seeing privilege, like walking past the whites-only cemetery and all these beautiful stones celebrated and cleaned and trimmed, the grass trimmed around them, even to that date in 2003. And those type of things, that in seeing these other images relative to Isaac J. Hill's story, Alexander Newton's parents, was very familiar to me. I had also, gone to other states relative to my family by then. I'd been in Kyle, Texas, standing at the gravestone of an enslaver of a member of my family, while off in the woods beyond me was where my family was buried. I'd also been in Baltimore, Maryland, where my third great grandfather, William Cooper, who fought in the Civil War as well, was in the Navy, was buried at Laurel Cemetery, a colored cemetery that was paved over in 1957, which is now just a parking lot. So look, again, all of these things were very familiar to me. I wanted to correct those things, and that's kind of what brought me to Dolly. I was trying to figure out how to do that for the Newton family, particularly with regards to his parents. And on social media, I ran into Dolly and all the work she had been doing with regards to Alexander. And so we talked. I was able to get out to Mount Peace Cemetery in Camden County and meet up with Dolly. I was also at the time working on correcting those issues with Isaac J. Hill's burial site. So I invited her to be on that program with regards to what we were doing there. And that went off a couple of weeks ago, where we created, or was able to get the U.S. Office of Veterans Affairs to give us a new headstone for Isaac J. Hill. We installed it, and we had a beautiful ceremony there celebrating him. The county worked with us, the city worked with us. I found the current day descendants, so the city presented a proclamation to those descendants. Dolly spoke there, so we had a collaboration at that event. It went incredibly well. And then with that collaboration, between states, you may have seen we were at the old State House a few weeks ago, and Dolly, as Dolly stated, she premiered her film there, which is an amazing film, by the way. And that, I think, went off incredibly well. And I was honored to be able to share the stage after that showing to do a Q&A. So more collaboration around this particular story. Also, with regards to Alexander Newton's parents, I've been working for, I don't know, 6 months or so, trying to solve for that their stone at Evergreen Cemetery that had been buried, was just seeping into the ground after falling over some 50 plus years ago. I started like a grassroots effort to raise money to try to figure out how to do something for these folks. We pulled in Mark Omerod of Monument Preservation and Restoration, and he came in and looked at the stone. After I'd been told by a few folks that, John, you can't repair that stone, just bury it and get a new one for them. Mark said, no, I think I can repair it. Bless him. And because I did not want to discard the stone. It was the original stone that Mary picked out. And Mark looked at it and agreed he could fix it. He was able to pull it out of the earth. It took a lot of time. We had to wait through winter and then start up again in spring. And eventually he got that thing out of the ground and started working on it. We also, in working with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, got a new stone for Alexander's brother, Stephen Newton. Again, bless Dale Fiore of Evergreen Cemetery. He agreed to take delivery of the stone, stored it there in their garage until we could get to the spring. And then I worked with the Connecticut Freedom Trail as well to get the site of Mary and Thaddeus Newton on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. So we eventually got a memorial stone for Alexander's brother installed right next to their parents, Mary and Thaddeus, that repaired stone, as well as a Connecticut Freedom Trail marker installed there as well. It looks amazing. It's incredible. We also worked to have a complete ceremony around this whole revived site. Shout out and blessings to Kelly Clarkson, who had me on her show to advertise and talk about what we were about to be doing at this particular place. We put the word out with regards to this celebration that we were going to have around these people, as well as I found current day descendants who didn't know the story. And they agreed to come to a celebration of the Newtons. And people showed up and agreed to come and speak that I never expected would agree to. But I feel incredibly honored that they did. Senator Blumenthal was there. The military was there. The Connecticut National Guard showed up. The Massachusetts 54th came down from Boston to celebrate the Newton family on Friday, June 21st, just a few days ago, as well as, again, the family, the descendants that I found, and military honors were provided, and the family was given the folded flag. This ultimately was a $6,000 effort. Again, that I want to point out that the Alex Brand Corporation fully funded directly from just grassroots fundraising to be able to put this all together. And we were really honored that the public saw it as a mission, something that we should be doing, and they all actually pitched in and helped us get there. I'm hopeful that in the future we'll be able to do this with many, many more folks beyond just Isaac J. Hill and Alexander Newton. And I'm also hopeful that I'm able to work with Dolly Marshall more often in the future to do similar things. I think we're have similar goals with regards to what we're attempting to do. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Wow, just wow. Thank you both so very much. It is so important to tell the Black narratives from the Black perspective. And I really appreciate the work that you're both doing. It's necessary, it's needed, and thank you for leading the charge. We do have a couple of questions and comments right here. Give me a second. Let me see how to get it over here. All right, let's see. Carolyn Clement says she would love to see this film. Where would she be able to see the film, Dolly?
It's coming soon, Carol, to our website, mountpeacecemetaryAssociation.org. So what you can do, go to the website and sign up for our newsletter. That way you'll get first notification when it drops.
Awesome. Thank you.
Adrian
says that Reverend Newton as a Mason, was he in an integrated or segregated Masonic chapter?
Wow, that's a good question. He actually, his Masonic career is very, very fascinating. He was in an all-colored African-American chapter, actually started right before the start of the Civil War. That was his first chapter that he was involved in, and he was a lifelong Mason. And like I said, he held very high leadership positions throughout. Also, another organization called the Knights of Pythias. He was a member of that as well, for you that know kind of Masonic history. If you ever get to Mount Peace where he's buried, you can see on his headstone has the Masonic symbols on it.
Awesome. Thank you. Nora says, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Sally says, this has been a fantastic presentation. I love the words and images you use to tell the story. Thank you so much. Sally also says, John Mills, you tell the story so clearly and powerfully. Thank you. Adrian says, I would like to hear more about what burial rights have meant to Black Americans, and as a discussion about the extraordinary resilience of anyone surviving the Middle Passages, slavery, and the terrors that follow, and any suggestions you may have about honoring their dignity in that, including that of living Black Americans as a way of countering the arguments around the generational health stress burden borne by current Black Americans. Wow, that's a mouthful. I think, Carolyn, Adrian, sorry, I think that is going to be a whole nother show, especially on the Middle Passage. We will be having speakers in the future speaking about that, so please stay tuned for that. But do either one of you want to speak to the burial rights?
John, you go.
Sure, I can speak to it from a perspective of simply having something that represents who these people were from a genealogy. I'm speaking of it from a genealogist perspective, right? Because when in doing research, I like to use a lot of things to try to find these people, and commonly some of the information that you're using is simply other stones, other people, other information around where those individuals may have been buried, and so I think burial rights, documentation with regards to who they are on stones, having and having these cemeteries restored or having them still exist is incredibly important to telling the story. And so, yeah, I'm a proponent for ensuring that we keep, these cemeteries intact. We restore them, we repair them, and I think, there was a cost, the lack of value in these people, and sometimes not having stones or sometimes not having the appropriate places to bury them. With regards to current day encountering arguments around generational health and stress, I think for me, like, the bigger challenge that I had as a child and coming up in the 70s and 80s was that there was this impression that if you told the story, these dank and dark stories, that in and of itself represented trauma, and thus and as if you were trying to guilt white Americans. And what I've learned is that in learning those stories, there's a power to it, there's a pride to it. It's like, I tell this analogy about how, if somebody tells you they ran a marathon, that doesn't mean anything unless you understand the months of training, the waking up at 3 a.m., the blisters and the bruises and the dehydration. If you understood the depths of the challenge it took, then you have a reverence for these people. Well, if you don't tell the accurate story about the enslaved, exactly what happened to them, then you leave me unable to revere them the way they should be, what they had to endure for me to exist. And so I would say, with regards to this idea of stress, I would counter that with, I think we should be telling these stories so we can get to reverence and pride.
Awesome.
I wanted to add to that because John mentioned about telling the stories. I do agree. I think a big way to combat the stress and the trauma is volunteering. I'm in a lot of cemeteries besides Mount Peace, and there's nothing more gratifying than going into a place that was forgotten or cast aside, or just never made a priority in the first place, and bringing it back into the forefront. The oldest portion of Mount Peace was overgrown with vegetation because it has a lot of issues with the landscape undulating, sinking. There's a lot of things that go into maintaining cemeteries as a whole. So I would implore, especially African Americans, whether you have family or that you know of or not, to get out to where your local Black cemeteries are, and start seeing where you could be of service. Because once you start doing that, it really does make you feel better. Start doing research on repairing headstones, coming in and cleaning headstones, or getting headstones for individuals who never had one. So that would be my suggestion.
I think that's a great suggestion, Dolly. Not only would you feel better, but it also gives you a connection to your past, to your heritage. And I think that's most important, because once you know where your roots are and how you are connected to the past, you realize the past isn't in the past, it's forever present. And we can learn from that. So thank you so very much. Rhonda says, what an amazing presentation. Thank you for your research. Rebecca says, great program. She also says, I love hearing how Mr. Mills does his research and uncovers these important stories. And then we have Iva, who says, Miss Iva says, okay, we're having technical difficulties. Amazing program. Well, at least it's the end of the show when it starts to end. But she says, amazing program. I thank y'all both so very much for gracing us with your knowledge and with your programs. Miss Dolly, I'm looking forward to seeing the movie as well.
I can't wait for you to see it.
Thank you very much for your research. I hate that I was not here for the big program, but I had to be elsewhere. But I understand it was a big success, and I heard nothing but rave reviews. So congratulations to you both on such a successful program. And again,
it's great working with John again. Yes.
Yeah.
It's been a whirlwind. Yeah. Right,
yeah.
John?
Well, I want to give both of you your flowers as you are here, to say thank you very much for using your platforms to benefit others. Because sometimes we have platforms and they are not used to benefit others. They're only for selfish gain. But you two make sure that the greater public at large is benefiting from your platform. So thank you so very much for doing that. It is so needed and it is appreciated. So thank you both for joining us. And we probably, with all the research you're doing, we'll probably have you back on for revisiting of what you two are up to, whether together or individually. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Thank you, John. Good seeing you all. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Connecticut.
Thank you, Dolly. Thanks a lot, Tammy.
You're so welcome. You two just hang out for a moment. Let me just do a little housekeeping, okay?
All right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone out in social media land, for joining us. I thank you for your questions and your comments. Please join us next month for Tuesday, July 23rd at noon, where we will be honoring the legacy, a guide of African-American monuments, with author Tammy Gibson, who is also a traveling historian. And then Tuesday, August 27th, 2024 at noon, we have Resistance, Language and Politics of Freedom in the Antebellum North with Elizabeth Pryor. And then, as we're headed into the fall already, Tuesday, September 24th at noon, the Charles A. Wright Museum with Jonathan Jones, where we will have a conversation beginning the series of Black-owned and Black presented museums. So thank you once again for joining us today. Again, please fill out our survey. Let us know how we're doing and let us know what you would like to hear. Until the next time.